Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with the One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I'm joined, as always and forever, by my good friend, my business partner, the dear Mr. Jason Neil Patrick Harris Johnston Yellen, or just Jason JY if you want to shorten that.
If you're nasty.
If you're nasty, if you please.
Welcome to 2025. Here we are. In the future.
January 6th, 2025. There you go. January
6th, such a funny time of year. Nothing ever happens. January 6th. It's just so quiet. Like just so sit quiet in your hands. Wait for something to happen.
I got to tell you, I feel like this is going to be an episode where people they're just going to be storming in on this episode. So we've got our very own Jessica Rabbit Guillermo Lomas joining us as well. Hello, Jess.
Hi. I didn't enjoy Jason saying nothing ever happens. He's definitely jinxed us. So now I think all the things happen this week. Thanks, Jason. I was trying to ease myself back into this. No.
Well, you know how this week really goes for Jason. The day this episode drops.
Yeah, what happens? Your balls drop? What
public service announcement, I will be having my first colonoscopy. If you're a gentleman and of a certain age, please go get yourself checked out. It is imperative. And I will be being seen to. I think that's the technical term. I'm no doctor.
Yeah.
Susannah would know better. She's got a doctor in the family.
You ruined the surprise. I was going to then introduce everybody to
for people who haven't seen the masthead.
Oh, right. We've got a masthead. All right. So let's finish the storming of the podcast. We're welcoming back to our podcast for our 2025 year in preview, the one, the only, the inimitable Susannah Skiver Barton, a.k.a. SSB. Hi, Susannah.
Hi, guys. I'm so happy to be here again. And I just want to take issue with one thing Jason said, which was gentlemen of a certain age. No, people of all genders of a certain age need to get their colonoscopies. Doesn't matter how you identify.
Is that true? Oh,
yes.
Interesting.
It's for everybody.
Oh, wow. Is it just middle-aged white dudes who complain about it to each other? Like nobody else is talking about this out loud?
I couldn't tell you, but if you hit age 50, you need to get a colonoscopy. Or
there you go.
At age 40, if you have a family history of colorectal cancer. This ends your public service announcement.
Wonderful. Look at it. See, this is why we look forward to seeing you. That's terrific information.
For the advice on colorectal cancer, you got it. Anytime. No, sorry. I should disclaimer.
Really fails.
This does not constitute medical advice. Please consult your physician.
I thought this was webmd.ssb.com. Is that about it?
Wow, I was going to call up the hospital and say, I'm not coming in Wednesday. I spoke to Susannah Skiver Barton. Like, it's all good now.
Nah, man, you just told us how old you are. You definitely need that colonoscopy. The discomfort of the colonoscopy is nothing compared to the discomfort of being treated for colorectal cancer.
I tell you, I've been harping on it. Joshua, who's clearly older than me and has nothing in the books for this. This is
we've not had a celebratory podcast episode to celebrate Joshua's trip to the doctor to get his colon checked out. Have we got something special lined up for that?
I was meant to make the appointment, and then I didn't make the appointment, and here I am, a full 51 years of age. Thank you very much. 1973 baby. And I have yet to have any doctor stick a camera up my butt.
Man,
you guys could have got like a 2-for-1 deal. You could have recorded a podcast during the whole thing.
It's like a couples massage, couples colonoscopy.
Jason, a little his and his.
So I just saw this over the break. Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney got their colonoscopies together and filmed the whole thing. They are our models for how we do this going forward.
Wow, where can you see that film? I mean, is that streaming on Netflix? Is it gonna crash the whole service like the fight?
I think YouTube might have it, but I haven't looked. I don't know.
Liar.
I think that might be Pornhub. I think you're looking at a different site altogether.
The description said it was Ryan Reynolds, but it was hard to tell.
He had 6 fingers, right? That's all I know. Should we?
All right. Why are we here? Public service
well,
announcements aside.
We're here to discuss whiskey and what whiskey may look like in 2025 and moving forward. And I remember last year, we started off the podcast saying, did we all do our homework and listen to, the previous year's episode to see if we were correct or incorrect? And I think we all agreed, no, none of us did the homework. And I'm here to say that I did not do that homework either. But oh boy,
the best part about previews though, is not looking back, right? Just being a superhero walking away from an explosion, just keep going into the future, right? Just keep making previews, predictions. Never look back. Never look if they came to fruition.
Isn't it the super villain that doesn't look back at the explosion?
No, you haven't seen My Spy. My Spy is primo. Highly recommend.
All right.
I was going to say that we have listeners to keep us checked. We don't need to do the homework. They will write in and frequently do to correct us. So I've just reached a point where I'm zen with whatever telling off is coming. That's fine by me.
I certainly hope that any listeners who do go back and listen to the 2024 year in preview tell us what we got terribly wrong.
I mean, well,
I did look at my notes from last year to see what I intended to talk about, but do you want me to? I think, and I recall that we talked about things like insane bourbon pricing and international markets for bourbon and all the bourbon being made, and I have some things to say about that for this year too.
Yeah.
But
so it's with that in mind, I feel as if we started off the year still in this mode of, oh my gosh, everybody's buying all the things, and shops are, continue to put $1,000, $2,000 price tags on Pappy this and Blanton's that, and, whatever. Like, it was just, bourbon was crazy. And every store imaginable had at least 60 barrel picks that they had and hoped that people would buy. And then as 2024 sort of ticked along, I think the industry took a left turn that I think took some people by surprise, maybe not everybody by surprise, at least how fast it was. And so my initial question to you, SSB, and I'd love to hear from anybody else, but did you see, did a bourbon bubble burst? Is it bursting now? Is it a correction from, an insane COVID? And this is what bourbon looks like today is what bourbon should have looked like in 2020 if there weren't a COVID? Like, what are your thoughts on that aspect?
What a simple question to answer.
That's a quick.
You are welcome.
Right? I think bourbon is just at the beginning of a really serious downward moment. I'm not going to call it a bursting of the bubble. I think there are a lot of small bubbles in bourbon right now, even down to like the individual distillery level or individual brand owner level. But I do not think that like bourbon as a whole is going to just pop and then deflate and then go nowhere. Like I believe in the enduring appeal of it as a beverage to a large number of drinkers. Mm-hmm. But there is so much of it that there aren't enough drinkers out there to buy it. Certainly not right now. And I think we did talk a fair amount last year about the potential for overseas markets for bourbon and how those are not really all that developed. I think a lot of especially the big bourbon makers have been hanging their hats on developing those markets, and they have not come along yet. And there are numerous reasons we could talk about why, not all of which I even know, but like a few that I could point to. And so for now, the domestic market is still kind of the big segment for bourbon drinking, and sales in the domestic market are plateauing to declining. So it's not a good moment. Even as distilleries continue to invest in production, lay down more barrels, expand, or new distilleries pop up, a lot of whom have built their business models on contract distillation. Sure. But the contract market is flooded with opportunity and producers and mature barrels now, to such an extent that like anyone who's entering the game now, hoping to sell their capacity to someone who wants to lay down a bunch of new make is years too late. They're years too late. And I know of distilleries that are essentially brand new, opened in the last 2-3 years, that are not producing anything at all. Oh, they won't admit that publicly, but they have no clients. They were counting on getting clients, and all the potential clients, had already signed on with maybe someone more established, or they didn't get the capital they needed because of interest rates. Or they saw that the trends in the market probably weren't going to pan out for their business model, so they pulled back, or they rejiggered or scuttled their plans altogether. Who knows? But the long and short of it is, TLDR, there's a lot of extra bourbon out there. There was a report that I did not get to read the full amount of because you have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to access it. But there's a report showing like current inventory levels of bourbon and how it compares to projected demand. If demand goes up by a certain amount, if demand stays the same, if demand declines by a certain amount, even if demand goes up by, I think it was around 5% over the next 5 years, we would still have an excess of supply in Kentucky bourbon. Not maybe like a catastrophic excess, but still quite to the tune of hundreds of thousands of barrels. And there's no sign that demand is going up. In fact, all the data shows demand declining. I don't think anything's going to stop that decline. The decline might even accelerate. And we can talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to other whiskey categories as well. But yeah, there's a lot of extra bourbon. There are a lot of investors, so like private equity, who got into investing in bourbon at scale a few years ago when, like barrels of new make were going for $2,000, or I'm just making that up, but like going for big money. And then mature bourbon was going for even bigger money. And these private equity guys were like, great, let's go in. Let's pay for 20,000 or 50,000 barrels. We'll sit on them for 4 years, and then, we'll liquidate them and make this much profit. Well, 4 years later, like lots of people have done that. All that mature bourbon is hitting the market. Nobody's getting that price they projected. They're not even able to sell it at a lower price. Ask me how I know. I've talked to independent bottlers of American whiskey who have said like, the prices just keep going down. And we're not eager to buy because we think they're going to go lower. But even if they don't, they're still going to be there in a year. So we don't have to buy it today. We don't need it today. We already have what we, So the bubble of speculator barrels is definitely bursting. And I think that that's probably a good thing. I don't think it was ever great for the industry long term to have just a bunch of like venture capitalists in there laying down whiskey that they don't care how it tastes. They don't care how it's matured. They don't care about building a brand. They just wanted to make money. Like that's destructive for an industry like ours that is built on, I think, personal connections and relationship a lot of the time.
And it was certainly one of those ongoing conversations that we were having within Single Cask Nation, which was if you buy a cask at this price, and then you pay to have it bottled, and then you pay to have it transported to a warehouse, and then you want to try and sell it onto a consumer, your bottle price was getting so high that the proposition had stopped making sense. So the idea that you could just sit on barrels and magically sell them in the future for exorbitant fees never seemed to hold water in the moment. Unfortunately, the market was still climbing, and so people firmly believed they would continue to get away with it. To see similar casks now being sold for less than they were originally purchased for, I think there's a little bit of, schadenfreude there, where you're kind of getting a little chuckle behind a quiet Pam. But one of the things I remember us talking about last year, Susannah, and I continued it through a lot of my conversations in 2024, was we talked about bottle pricing, and we talked about the idea that we would see bottles drop in price again. However, if you were a savvy consumer, you knew that, and so you kept buying. If you saw just a little dip, you bought at that because you knew there was enough demand that you could get away with it. What did you then see through the rest of 2024 on the very pricing on shelves? And in talking to consumers, what are you hearing from consumers, and what did they see for this market?
To be honest, I talk more to retailers and suppliers than I do to consumers, except, I guess I talk to consumers, but we don't usually talk about prices. I don't know. I will tell you, though, I think what I've seen based on observing what's sitting on shelves collecting dust, and not in the good old Dusties way, but just like new Dusties, is that there's like price fatigue at a level that 2 or 3 years ago people probably would have not questioned buying. Yeah. I think if you're around $50 right now as a solid, at least 4 years old American whiskey, straight bourbon specifically, you're okay. $50 or below, pretty solid territory. And weirdly enough, I think above 100, if your volumes are small, if you're a boutique brand who's selling something truly unique and special. So you can't just be like, oh, it's, such and such straight bourbon, $110, and there's like a pretty story on the back, but there's no special information about it. There's nothing that's compelling. No, that's probably not going to be that successful. But if you're like, hey, I'm straight bourbon from this craft distillery and I'm 8 years old and I was made with, heirloom grain. Okay. And it's not for everybody, but I think those higher tiers are still doing okay when you have a really good couple of selling points. But between like 60 and 100, I think is really tough territory right now, unless you have a really good age statement, or I don't know, just have such viral appeal that people, so I mean, any Buffalo Trace product, fine. But, of course. But I think it's really, there's so much sitting around between the 60, let's say $60 and $80, so much sitting around. That's just like, it's just nothing. It's mid. It's something sourced. It could be very good quality. I'm sure most of it is, but it's something sourced, bottled by a person who owns a brand rather than a distillery. And it's around 4, maybe up to 6. And there's not much, and it might, look, they're all trying to bottle cask strength. And they're like, look, you get, more value for your money at barrel proof. Yep. But questionable, because a lot of stuff, a lot of times I think people are just buying barrel proof because they don't have to taste the rest of the whiskey. That's my hot take.
Whoa, you just slid that right in there.
You heard it here first, everybody.
It's just, there's a lot of that sourced stuff that people, again, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago said, hey, I think I can make a brand, and I think I can, target my bottle price here, and I think people will buy it. They weren't counting on there being dozens, maybe even hundreds of other people doing the same thing, but there's just a lot of, it's a crowded shelf, and to stand out, you got to go back to what I think long-standing whiskey brands of any stripe have always known as quality product, like solid and authentic, storytelling or marketing about your product. And, not yanking your consumers around. Because I've seen too, lots of brands that got started with really excellent single barrels, like truly awesome, beautiful single barrel whiskeys that they priced pretty moderately for whatever, let's say this was like 4 or 5 years ago, a great single barrel whiskey for $60, barrel proof, whatever. And then people lapped it up and it went crazy on social media and everyone's like, you got to get this latest thing. And then, they ran out of those couple dozen really good single barrels they had and just started bottling whatever else they could get their hands on. And it was very mediocre. And that carried those brands, thus so far. And then they have now run into the wall that everyone else is running into, which is people are buying less, people are being more choosy about where they spend their money. And I think especially people who got into whiskey during COVID have really developed their palates enough that they can say, well, I like this and I don't like this. This one's really good and this one's just okay. Whereas like at the beginning of your whiskey journey, I think it's really easy to not be able to make those judgment calls because you just haven't experienced enough whiskey yet. But the surge of COVID bourbon bros has matured. And that's also hitting, I think, a lot of brands that maybe again didn't put flavor and quality first when they were brand building.
You brought up packed shelves, which has me, that's an issue too, right? There's so many brands available, and this isn't just bourbon. I think this can go for other types of whiskeys as well. But one of the things that I've heard over 2024, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Susannah, is a number of distributors stopped onboarding new brands because they weren't selling the inventory they had on their already existing brands. And so from the top down, spirits portfolio managers were told, sorry, no new brands. And in some cases, even if it's an established brand within a portfolio, and this is a broad brush statement, I'm not saying this rings true for every distributor, but this is what I'd been hearing through multiple grapevines. Even with established brands, the distributors would say, well, we're not going to bring in this special edition, or we're not going to bring in X, Y, and Z because we haven't sold out of A, B, and C just yet. So that's even before store shelves. So I wonder if you've got any insight on that.
I don't have special insight, but I've definitely heard the same things.
Yeah.
That, it's almost impossible to get on the shelf with a major distributor right now, because they, like you said, the shelves are packed, they're not selling at retail, and therefore the distributor is not going to try to push more onto their retail partners. I don't know what to say about that, except I wouldn't be trying to launch a new brand in 2025. And to your point, with distributors saying, we're not going to take your limited edition XYZ because we haven't sold through ABC, I would, for brands that have really expansive lineups, I would be taking a good hard look at what the industry likes to call rationalizing. Yeah. At Compass Box did that this past year. They and they've always had lots and lots of limited editions. I don't think those are necessarily going away, although I think anecdotally, they feel like they've slowed in the last couple of years. I'd have to go back and kind of like do my math and see. But they certainly, they sort of trimmed down their core line to four offerings, only one of which is what I would call a Compass Box original, which is the Peat Monster. Two of which are brand new, and one that came out like in the last 5 years. And I think that was probably a really savvy business decision to try to keep Compass, what there is of Compass Box, like keep it available, keep it on a shelf at retail, make sure that customers have access to it. I'm sure they're not the only one who's done this or will be doing this. But I think that's an interesting thing to point out, Joshua, and certainly something to keep an eye on. One thing I have noticed kind of in that vein, not necessarily having to do with the distributors kind of putting a stoppage to or throttling, the rollout of new releases, but I have seen major distilleries bringing back their age statements or adding new age statements this year in a way that feels it's like, okay, they can do it because they've obviously worked out any shortage problems they had with age statement whiskey, but it also feels very calculated in that in this moment where there's so many bottles on the shelf and competition is so fierce for those dwindling consumer dollars, it's a really smart move to grab them because, as we all know, regardless of anything else, a number on a bottle is a huge selling point for a large number, the majority, I would say, of whiskey drinkers. I think that will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
I want to circle back to a bigger question about America, but for Jess as boots on the ground, and we were talking a little bit about bourbon in global markets and foreign markets and the growth. What do you see over in the UK, Jess, around bourbon? Do you get the sense that it's still in the ascendancy, or is it starting to slow in the UK? Are palates evolving, like Susannah's saying over here?
I think it's a bit difficult. I mean, I'm definitely not at the forefront of pushing bourbon as a drink in the UK, not for any particular reason other than that there's plenty of other things to keep me occupied with. I think bourbon is really difficult here in the UK. Like, the people that I know that are solidly very much into bourbon, there's not many outlets within the UK other than a mate who's going with a big suitcase to the US to get anything particularly super exciting. We do get like the big names. There is, of course, the retailers who will fight every year for their allocations of the antiques collection from Buffalo Trace. There are people who get Pappy allocations, but they're not big. And I know that like even the amount of Pappy coming into the UK is a lot smaller than it was in, say, like 5 years ago. And they're shifting their focus between putting it into on-trade. I was talking to a friend who runs a store, was saying the focus goes a lot more to on-trade rather than off-trade retailing. So, for example, every year Good Spirits here in Glasgow do a tasting, and the last one that we did, they said they had significantly less stock given to them. So I don't, and I know Matthew's probably listening, but I don't remember him saying there was really bottles to buy. There's some years that I've been to their tastings, we've been, there's been a group of us, we've shared out bottles if we've won. They do a raffle system. It's very fair, which again, I think is part of the problem. If it's this highly scarce allocated stuff, how do you make that fair? That's not just a bourbon problem. We have the same thing with Scotch whiskey. If you're a small store, where should it be? Should it be a turn up and maybe it'll be on the shelf on a random day? Is it a make your punters bear box outside and whoever wins gets the right to the bottle? I've been to a bunch of different retailers that have different ideas, and how do you make it fair? When that's the kind of thing people want, but I don't know if you're a smaller bourbon brand, how you would get attention in the UK with that at all. There's so few specialist bars offering it, and the bars that are bourbon, bourbon in air quote bars, they've obviously got a stronghold with the big names. I don't know if I was, like a small new boutique bourbon brand and I decided, because I clearly lost my mind, that targeting the UK was the way to do it. I don't even really know where you'd start. I think you would probably have to go to London and hope that you could maybe target on trade and get bartenders behind you and start some sort of like foot traffic towards a brand, because I think putting it on a shelf would be really difficult in the UK. With like no further details. I guess maybe in the US you guys are more used to the stories about, especially if they're a young brand, maybe sourcing. That's still a really weird concept and a conversation to have here in the UK. And you have to have a conversation. It's not people are like, all right, that's great. Yeah, we'll take one of those and go. They're like, what is that? Wait, you didn't make that, but it's a, ooh. And that's coming from somebody who spends their days at whiskey festivals explaining that we didn't make any of this liquid on the table in front of us. Single Cask Nation have got barrels and casks from people, and that can be difficult. So I can't imagine how it is to be like as an independent bottler, you're not facing as a brand, like this is going to be a representative of our liquid. Like it's a very obviously a different category. I can be straight up saying, look, this is no representation of what we're going to do in the future. This is the thing we like that we put in a bottle for you. As a brand, having a representation, like source liquid so that in 5 years' time you can come back and it'll be our bourbon, I think is probably quite a difficult proposition. There are definitely a few distilleries here in Scotland who have done similar things. Notably, people like Rassi and Ardnamurchan had kind of while we wait projects, which were good. And I think if you are a young brand, you have a bit more breathing space to explain that. But in terms of bourbon in the UK, it's really difficult. I mean, I think the biggest American whiskey story that happened in the UK this year was really that Beyonce launched rye with some extremely tenuous stories. I can't stress this so much. I really want to try this. I do not know anywhere. So if you're a podcast listener and you know better than me, please tell me. I do not know anywhere in the UK that I could go and get a dram of it. I can easily buy bottles, no sweat. But there's not a single bar that I've come across yet in Glasgow who are proudly stocking Beyonce's Sir Davis at the front of the bar. And I really want to try it. Like, it's got some interesting heritage behind it. There's a story. It's got a fairly solid background, and that's a massive.
Thomas in the Bond didn't just grab a bottle.
Thomas has already got it mixed in. I don't know something.
He may not be a fan of the Queen Bee. That could be that.
I'll tell him that tonight. But if that's a massive brand with a pretty hefty marketing budget, and they're kind of getting a bit of traction in the UK. I can't imagine what it would be like to try and be a smaller guy breaking their way in. I meant to ask you guys when it happened, was the Beyonce a massive deal in the US too?
It was pretty big.
Yeah.
It was a massive deal. I think it was a massiver deal outside of whiskey person circles, right? So, yes. I mean, it was certainly caused a lot of, stir for whiskey drinkers, but I think it was much bigger for people who don't currently drink whiskey but love Beyonce and might now be drawn into whiskey through it. I'm glad you brought it up, Jessica, because I also remember we did last year. I posited the question, and then later in the year wrote an article about why is there no Casamigos for bourbon? Like, where's the big celebrity bourbon? And then after I wrote that article later in the year last year, several months later, the news about Beyonce's whiskey came out, and I still don't think that it's going to be big on the level that Casamigos was for George Clooney. I don't think it's even going to approach it, but if anyone can make a go of a solid, setting the bar sort of celebrity whiskey, I do think it's probably Beyonce in partnership with LVMH.
Yeah. Right. She obviously read your article and was inspired.
Pretty sure it was in the works long before that, but
I'm standing by for 2026 this year in preview episode for us to be like, wow, this Taylor Swift this Taylor Swift bourbon is outstanding. I will buy cases of it.
Honestly, I actually think if Taylor Swift launched it, because Sir Davis is a rye, which was an interesting choice, and certainly rye is tiny fraction of sales compared to bourbon. But if Taylor Swift launched a bourbon specifically, I don't know what would happen. I think it would be huge, though.
That's all the sales taken care of. I think we could just sort of wipe our hands and be like, right, job done. Who's next? Step up.
I mean, look, guys, there are literally tens of thousands of barrels of 4-year-old bourbon just begging for buyers. So if you have some capital and a connection with Tay-Tay, I think you should go for it.
The problem with her bringing out a bourbon brand is the haters. They're just going to hate.
Let them hate. She has enough fans. It does not matter. Just like Beyonce, she's a hustler. She's a good businesswoman. She's got a great head on her shoulders. For
her cocktail, though, you would have to shake it off, not stir it off.
Yeah, it'd be some kind of sour.
So we're pretty deep in the weeds for bourbon here, but I think it starts to show that shifting landscape. And I think when bourbon, and this goes back to a regular conversation with Bill Thomas that I've been quoting on the podcast, but he actually saw bourbon overtake Scotch sales, but felt like Scotch would always be there for him. And now I think that we're actually seeing ourselves in the ascendancy on bourbon. Scotch, still there. As you look around, Susannah, and you were mentioning Compass Box a moment ago and them kind of tightening up their line of offerings and age statements appearing on bottles of bourbon, are you seeing similar moves in the Scotch category? Are you getting a sense of Scotch is a bit more of a solid proposition than bourbon? Bourbon had this moment in the sun and is now receding into the shadows. What are you seeing there?
I don't think I would want to be a Scotch producer right now either. I agree with Bill's assessment that like Scotch is always there, and Scott, you know, and you guys can all see me, but the podcast listeners can't. I have my arm, you know, moving parallel to the table, moving it like Scotch is just this steady flow, reliable friend, but Scotch sales are not up. Scotch sales are way down. You look at the numbers from the Scotch Whisky Association, and to me, they look borderline catastrophic. Scotch whiskey exports in 2023 were the same as they were in 2013.
Wow.
Yeah.
Holy
but think about all the extra production, particularly of single malt, that has happened between 2013 and 2023. So I don't know. I don't think a lot of bourbon drinkers who are stepping back from kind of the feeding frenzy of the last few years, I don't think they're necessarily turning to Scotch. I'd say most of them are probably not turning to anything. They might be drinking less.
They may be going to something. They
may be trying some cannabis alternatives.
Yep.
But for Scotch whiskey, and you guys probably would know many things I don't know as buyers and bottlers of it. It seems like there's a big puddle, if not a lock.
Those words, you're triggering the internet. I can hear them running.
That no one wants to talk about.
Yep.
Because they don't want to freak out their shareholders. But at some point, the piper will have to be paid.
The line that I saw in 24 about the previous export was that value was holding even if volume was down. And I listened very carefully when you talked a moment ago, Susannah, where bourbon pricing up to about $50, you've probably got a pretty solid market. Above $100, you've got a bit of a market happening there, and somewhere in between. And I'm seeing something similar for Scotch in that as well, right? And one of the things we have talked about within Single Cask Nation through 2024 is the consumer is very price aware. And I would even say price conscious. I would say aware of what does it mean that they're putting into their glass and what are they tasting? And I'm really taking away the comment you made, and I had not spent a second thinking about it, but the evolution of the drinker who came online in COVID, and what does it mean for them and their palate in 24 and 25? I think that is a fantastic point. And I'm trying to think about it live, but then my mouth stops working. And so I will be thinking about that through this year.
I will say in Scotch's defense, I think despite the fact that there's a lot of overpriced single malt Scotch on the shelves, Scotch overall, speaking broadly, very broadly, tends to hit a higher quality mark than the broad, huge, encompassing world of bourbon. And we don't have to talk about the reasons for that, but some of it is, a lot of it is probably that the Scotch Whisky Association keeps really tight leash on all its members, and it's that they've spent decades, probably a century at this point, you know, kind of keeping the bar high and requiring everyone to hit that bar for the sake of the reputation of Scotch as a whole. And it's worked out well for them. Whereas bourbon is a little bit freer, a little more loosey-goosey, nothing wrong with that either. But because of that, there's been, I think some consumers have gotten burned out on spending that $75, $80 on a bottle of something that they opened and it wasn't exciting. It wasn't worth that price to them. So Scotch at least usually has that going for it. Yeah. Macallan notwithstanding, but second hot take.
I don't think that's a hot take to anybody. Yeah. Everyone knows that. There's no news there. I was hoping you would name somebody a bit more, you know, like fruity that we could really clutch our pearls at as an announcement.
But I think the corollary exists there as well. We were talking about the price of casks and investment and speculation, and the cost of Scotch cask got so far out of control, you couldn't put it into a bottle to sell it to a consumer. We're seeing that soften. We're not seeing a return to, 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, depending what latest lists come out this week. But again, a new independent bottler appearing on the scene every day. Is that slowing down or not? No. Jess gives us a fervent, absolutely not.
I feel like there's at least 3 new ones that I found before Christmas. So I don't think it's going. I think it's maybe...
I think it's going to increase.
I think it's... there's a whole bunch of people that I'm looking at while we're here, that I'm looking at wondering where on earth they're getting liquid from and how they can sustainably continue to get liquid. That's what's interesting. And because we have such a closed industry, and I don't know if bourbon works the same way, but there's such kind of cloak and dagger concealment. People whisper in dark corners about where to find casks if they really feel like it's worth sharing or they want to be friends with you, but there's no Facebook page for independent bottlers being like, hey, hit up Steve, he's got 50 casks of this week. There's none of that chat happening. And so I wonder if you're new, there's loads of people. I felt like for a while there was loads of people that were coming in from other industries, and that's great because they were really dedicated whiskey fans, and that's really nice that they wanted to take their passion forward and make it into a thing. I was kind of looking at them being like, but where are you getting this liquid from? Like, if this is just you coming into the game in 2022, 23, where are you reasonably getting liquid that you can lay down sustainably for the future for and get it? And I find it it makes my nose twitch a bit. But I guess we're going to have to ride it out in our... you can't nail me to an answer in our 2025 preview. We're going to have to ride it out and see what happens. And I'd be very interested to see if that eases up as maybe some of this cask investment stuff winds its way out a little bit. That people they're bringing in much stricter enforcement about advertising. I don't see that putting a lot of these people off. These advertising firms are all over my Facebook feed and Instagram. And now that we've discussed it here today, my Instagram will definitely be full of adverts with these bastards. And I find that really funny. I don't know if I told you two, but when we were at Kendall Whiskey Festival, I chatted to a guy who was proudly telling me how many casks he was holding in an investment company. And I was like, that's nice. What are you planning on doing with them? And he said, well, I'm going to sell them to independent bottlers like you. And I just was like, oh, mate, we're nearly at Christmas and I really don't want to rain on your parade, but I'm not going to buy these from you. And if I do, so I kind of tried to explain it in a really, 30 seconds, don't make the punters unhappy way. And I was like, well, you do need to think about, obviously, when you sell the casks, you want to sell it at a price that you're going to have made a little bit of money on, and that will make you happy. But I, as a business, need to make a little bit of money to keep my lights on. And the shop who's selling it need to make a little bit of money because they're also a business. And then we need to make sure all those little bits of money add up okay, because when you come to my table at a festival, if I'm pouring you whatever it is, 10-year-old blah blah single malt, and it's at £200, you're going to go, oh Jesus, don't buy anything from them. Yeah. And so I just need you to think about where my price on a table, maybe where that comes from. And so I think whilst you may find independent bottlers who will buy these casks from you, I think you need to be realistic about this, because the price that I think you're going to ask for this cask, an independent bottler is going to say no thanks to. And that doesn't matter whether a small independent bottler like us or one of the bigger guys, they're not going to want to pay your cask plus your 300% investment return, part of your 10-year exit strategy, blah, blah, portfolio words, you know, and I think that's quite scary.
But in thinking about the year ahead, though, listening to how the four of us are talking here, I'm hearing quality and I'm hearing engagement with the consumer. And I think we've come through a period where we were just simply trying to get casks. Yeah. And once you can get your hands on casks, you work out, okay, what story can we tell here? What can we do with this? But I think, you know, to be so driven by quality and not to just have the latest bottle that you can sell and hopefully make money on. I can hear this shift where if consumers had lost power, and you know, we talked about this in today's conversation, right? You know, showing up at a store to stand in a queue where you may get a chance to buy a bottle. How's that good for the consumer, right? That's when I stopped looking at bourbon, when the gamification of bourbon was too much for me and I stopped playing the game. I think if you're now the consumer, the control is shifting back to you and you get to say, and listening to Susannah today, right? How do I spend my dollar? Does that fit my palate? Do I want to commit to that? Like, I think the four of us are all consumers here as well. And I think it becomes exciting as a consumer. But for the three of us who are on the production side and the selling side of this, we have to be very aware of the power that consumer now wields. And we've always respected the nation. There's never been any doubt about that. We're not changing how we do business. But I'm hopeful for us, we could potentially bring in some new consumers who are saying, oh, there's an entity driven by quality and driven by the consumer. So I will sit quietly. I will yield the rest of my time.
Can I throw in here, because I was thinking about this, like a lot of when Susannah was talking about bourbon, I really felt like we could have been swapping those words for like Scotch. Like a lot of the experiences I feel like are the same both sides of the pond. And I think if you are, like you were saying, one of the big guys, one of the big brands, you're probably okay because you can ride this out. You can weather the storm a little bit longer than somebody who's not so anxiously watching their cash flow. They're thinking more about, like, you know, how to keep shareholders happy. One of the funniest ways of trying to make fair access to big hotshot releases of bourbon that I have seen remains a bar in Seattle called the Doctor's Office. If you guys have come across Dr. Matt, and they do every year with their Pappy releases, they put a Boilermaker on their menu that's called the Pap Smear. And it is a Boilermaker of one, I think it's Pappy 15 this year, and Smirnoff Ice, very classy, keeping it classy. And the price of the Boilermaker pays for 2 Pap Smears through a charity organization that Matt partners with, which I just think is very cool. Wonderful. So you're drinking Pappy, being a bourbon bro, but also doing some slices of good work. So I enjoy that. That's how he uses his allocation. So there are a whole bunch of other really creative ones that I see, especially when it comes to Pappy, because I was talking about good spirits. But that one just came on my mind as we were talking there, and I thought I need to tell the listeners. So if you are near Seattle, go and check out the Doctor's Office. They will also write you a prescription for why you can't come to work the next day. They have like a whole bunch of very funny prohibition-based jigs and also very good cocktails. So that's my selling piece for Pappy.
Sazerac hasn't cut off their Pappy allocation for that.
I wanted to quickly harken back to age statements really quickly before we forget here, because Susannah, you wrote an article sometime middle of last year. It was right around the time that Glenmorangie switched their 10-year-old original to a 12-year-old. And of course, the majority of the internet said, oh, this is fantastic. We're getting an older liquid at the same price. Happy days. And you said, well, wait a second here. And so I wanted to touch on some of this. I wanted to bring in a good news topic, but that's going to come in a little bit. But first, I wanted to touch on this with age statements in mind.
Yeah, ever the contrarian. I had to look a gift horse in the mouth. Yeah, I mean, so overall, no, it's not a bad thing to see Glenmorangie raising the age statement on original, but that was the hook for me saying, actually, though, why are they doing this? When original was 10 years old this whole time and selling great, it's one of the top selling Scotch whiskeys, single malt Scotch whiskeys rather, in the United States. Why would they be raising the age statement? Well, I think the answer is that they can, and they have a whole lot of whiskey because they expanded majorly around 2010, 9, 12. I can't remember. Maybe around I feel like it was maybe around 2009. And so, yeah, they've had a lot. They were responding to the boom in Scotch whiskey sales back then, and all that liquid they've been laying down has reached a dozen years of age. And so perhaps also in an effort to compete with the other entry-level single malts like Glenfiddich and Glenlivet at age 12, those are kind of the two top sellers. Maybe that's what Glenmo was doing as well. But I think overall it really pointed to a shift in Scotch whiskey availability. I don't know. It was it's a shift that I think we have to be paying attention to. And you guys as indie bottlers are going to have a really unique and interesting insider perspective on it that I will never have. But after I wrote that article that said, hey, I think this might not be great news for this reason. And the reason is an oversupply of aged single malt that has no one to buy it as of yet. I started thinking about all the non-age statement single malts that came out about 10 years ago to replace age statements, right? When there was sort of this quote unquote shortage of age statement single malt. So like I thought particularly about Oban. They came out with Oban Little Bay and they priced it higher than Oban 14-year-old. Initially, I think Oban 14 was priced around like $75 and Little Bay was like $90. And I think that pricing flopped spectacularly because they seemed to pull it back after, a year or two. But I don't know if Oban Little Bay is even still being made. I think it probably is because I don't think Diageo would just like cut it off. But when was the last time you saw it on a shelf or a menu, right? Like Oban 14 is still out there chugging along. It's a great whiskey. But I was like, huh. And I have done no even cursory, anecdotal like research or looking at shelves to see like what other NAS products might have perhaps disappeared or pulled back a bit in comparison to their age statement brethren. But if I did, I would not be surprised to find that the age statements are really back front and center with the NAS stuff taking a back seat. Why? Because now Diageo and everybody else has enough to resupply those age statements abundantly. And they know that those age statements are going to sell better than the NAS. Like was there ever an NAS product that came out and people just immediately were like, wow, this is so great. And they became lifelong fans? I don't think so.
Octomore, maybe.
Nah, but Octomore does have an age statement.
Oh, that's right. Octomore does have, it's 5 years.
Octomore
Typically
famously is either 5 or 10. Like that's the two. They spent a long time saying we'll never do it older, and then they started dropping 10s. So I don't buy that either.
I think when is Brook Laddie going to get back to the 10-year-old classic Laddie instead of the NAS one? And hopefully soon.
Well, I just love knowing that we've got listeners shouting at this recording right now with their beloved NAS. Please email us info@singlecastnation.com.
I would love to know. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have like a couple of points here before they fly out of my head because you keep making really good ones. First of all, from my days of retailing, which admittedly now is a long time ago, Talisker Storm was always pretty solid. From the second they introduced that. So I would counter that as my strong entry of NAS that I think does stand on its own, unrelated to it. I think Talisker Portree, not as good, but Talisker Storm I quite liked. The Darkest, I could take it or leave it. I think sticking within Diageo, Mortlach, famously in the UK, they stripped all the numbers off And we had these stupid, like, rare old, and they did apologize. There's an actual apology, and they've shoved some numbers back on Mortlach. So I think there are examples. I think your Oban one tickles me because Oban is really not marketed here in the UK the same way it is to the US. Like, I can't tell you the number of Americans that come over asking for Oban. And once we've established we are talking about the same distillate, it's really like it's got its fans here in the UK, but definitely not in the way they have pushed it into the US, which I think is very interesting. That's clearly a decision was made a number of years ago. And I'm sure there will be historians listening to this that can tell me why Oban was pushed to the US in a way that it wasn't done here, or at least not as outwardly here as it was. So that's my Mortlach did the dance, and of course Macallan famously did the dance with the colours, and perhaps some mean people have called them the stripper range. And then Macallan.
Are you calling me mean? Jess.
So they have numbers back on them. I also wonder if, I think your point is a very solid and probably the most accurate one about it's because they have loads of liquid that they can put higher numbers on. But I wonder if it's also a little bit of a distraction from the fact that we have a fairly healthy crop of new, can I call them new wave distilleries? Like the kind of post 2005 distilleries are establishing themselves in Scotland, who obviously don't have the luxury of being able to be like, well, we had a 10 and now we've made it 12. And they've done a lot of groundwork, I think, pushing for whiskey drinkers to not be hung up on that number on the front. Now, obviously, by and large, the vast majority will be like 18 equals better than a 12-year-old. But I think there is a solid, decent amount of groundwork done by people like Kilhoman, who refuse to put age statements on, at least on a regular basis. And their core range is entirely built around non-age statements. Maccabee, Saneg, and now my brain's failed me, Loch Gorm.
100%
100% Isla. None of these have ages attached. There are a bunch of special editions of Kilhoman where obviously they do celebrate when they have older stock that they can put it on the label and tell you. But by and large, they are not interested. Anthony Wills is famously, every time somebody asks him at Feshill, you know, when are you doing a 12-year-old? He rolls his eyes and says, well, do you not like what we're making now? You know, not interested, move on. So I think, and there are other examples, like I think a lot of what Arden American have done, yes, they've done some age numbers on their releases, but by and large, they're not putting age statements on either. They're more interested in being able to craft releases that are interesting or whatever their flavor of the month is that they want to share with you. So I think the younger distilleries can still do that in a way that is, like Jason keeps saying, it's an authentic story that relates to the quality, in the way that if you are selling Oban and you need to hit so many million cases this year, you don't have that kind of option. So, oh, look, we've now got an Oban 17-year-old, or, you know, whatever number becomes the selling point, rather than like, oh, this release is all about this field that we planted up for the first time with sassy barley and it's our first time distilling it on site. So I think numbers are, and always have been, a distraction. And now they're like, look, it's older, and if you can add in the same breath, same price. People are so like attached to their wallets. They're like, yes, better for same money. And they stop questioning it. So when people like you come along and ask those questions, like, well, why is it they've now suddenly got loads of stock? I think Highland Park are another prime suspect for it too.
Oh yeah.
Like, look at that single cask series. When they first started that, I was like, oh, these are pretty cool looking. I'm going to collect these. It's tasty liquid. And when I realized there was going to be about 1 million of them, I was like, yes, I'm just going to stop. They started putting them in markets that you would have to have, you know, like gone through friends. Like I have nobody who flies through Istanbul airport regularly, so I'm never going to get that. And I was like, let's write this all off. It's getting silly. And now I know. Guillermo Lomas is not there. And now they've got about, I don't know, someone will tell me 300 of those single casks, and they're all around about 12 years old, you know, it's the same time period.
Jess, I want to get back to your point about pap smears.
Of course.
And really the medical professions in general, but specifically, speaking of generals, the Surgeon General, and it was just, you know, last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever someone listens to this podcast, it'll be sometime in the past where it was announced the Surgeon General here in the U.S. wants to have a mandatory warning on any bottle that contains alcohol that says, hey, you could get cancer if you drink this stuff. Not dissimilar from the government warning that went on cigarettes. And so SSB, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Is it definitely happening? Yes or no? How do you think it will affect sales, if at all? Like, will it be like a parental advisory on records where, it increases the sales, what are we to expect here?
I think it will happen eventually. I do not think it will happen soon. Okay. A couple reasons. It took a really, really long time for them to put those warning labels on cigarette packs. I looked at it. It was like 1984. They started warning you about cancer on cigarette packs, but they were having conversations about this, right, in Congress, like 2 decades before then. And certainly people knew for the entire 20th century, if not longer, that there was a link between smoking and death. Because my grandmother, who was born in 1918, called cigarettes coffin nails. So I think the apparatus of the United States government and lobbyists will keep this from happening soon. But I also think it probably will eventually happen because there is a link between consuming alcohol and cancer. And a lot of people don't know that. But it is an important thing to know. It's also important to know that the majority of people who drink alcohol don't do so at levels where it creates a substantial increase in your risk for most of these cancers. So I happen to be married to an oncologist, and I haven't talked to him like at length about the Surgeon General's announcement. But we certainly talk about cancer a lot because that's his daily work. Yeah. And I asked him, I was like, help me understand what we know about the link between alcohol and cancer as compared to the link between tobacco, nicotine, and cancer. Because I feel like I've known my whole life from, consciousness practically. Whereas the alcohol thing definitely seems to have made its way into my consciousness much more recently, certainly as an adult and not as a teenager. Mm-hmm. And one of the bottom lines that I took away from this very brief conversation we had was that it's really heavy alcohol use that corresponds most closely to these great increases in cancer risk. So if you're a moderate drinker, which is 1 at most 2 drinks a day, I think your risk level is far lower than if you are a heavy drinker who's, having a 6-pack every day, or the equivalent thereof. Mm-hmm. So I don't even remember what your original question was, except what do I think about this? I don't think it's a bad thing that people are aware of what causes disease. I think it's good to I think the more knowledge individuals have, then the better they can make decisions for themselves. I think the industry is going to fight it really hard. It's expensive to implement something like this. And of course, it probably in the long run leads to decreased sales. Certainly, there's a huge fear among alcohol producers and sellers of this neo-prohibitionist movement that seems to be small but vocal, that of scientists or policymakers who say any amount of alcohol is bad and you should not drink any alcohol, and probably ultimately want to outlaw the sale of alcohol again, which we all know how that went the last time. I think that's a valid fear, and it's certainly something worth pushing back against, both as a consumer and of course as if you happen to work in this industry. But I do not think it's a good look to push back against informing people that the product you sell might cause them harm. Now, on the other hand, like if we're going to add cancer warnings to bottles of alcohol, I think we probably could make an argument that we should be adding health warnings to other products that no one is talking about yet. Any number of foods or soft drinks could carry such warnings. That would be an even tougher battle. Can you imagine Coca-Cola going up against the U.S. government if they wanted to add a warning about, the addictive properties of sugar or whatever else. So in that sense, I'm like, well, where does it stop? Like how, there are many carcinogens we're never going to put a label on that are literally just floating around in the air because we are a society addicted to cars, and we have a lot of manufacturing processes that even with good regulations still release a lot of destructive stuff into the air that we breathe in and that harms us over our lifetime. But alcohol is a really easy scapegoat, and particularly for people who see the real harms that it does in individual health, and in more, I think, pertinently for the Surgeon General in terms of public health. So that was a very long-winded non-answer. I'm not sure that was at all helpful.
Well, let me add that. So I don't think that was a non-answer. I thought that was excellent. I want to add on this point to it, though, and I certainly do not have the specific numbers on this. But, if we're looking at 1984 and the Surgeon General's warning going on cigarettes then, cigarette sales didn't really decline significantly until the sin taxes were put on them year over year over year. I quit smoking in 1991. A pack of cigarettes was $1.75. That was my limit. Once it went past $1.57 and it hit $1.75, I said, boom, I'm done. I'm not smoking anymore. Now we're looking at anywhere between, depending on the state, depending on the brand, between $12 and $18 for a single pack of 20 cigarettes. And that surely is going to be something that would, dissuade people from buying cigarettes. But then you've got alternatives like vapes and things like that. So with Jason's point previously about people not just being conscious about their wallet, but being aware about what's coming out of their wallet, do you feel that the warning itself would have a significant effect on sales of alcohol, or will it take sin taxes applied to that to really make that a factor?
I do not have an answer for that. I think we could go down a big rabbit hole about minimum unit pricing, which Jess probably knows a bit about because it's implemented in Scotland. I would tell us we're more than an hour into this recording. I do not think we should go down that rabbit hole today.
Okay. No, fine.
But it's a great question. I don't have an answer for. I will say I don't think something like putting a Surgeon General's warning on a bottle of single malt Scotch, I don't think that's going to affect a lot of sales of single malt Scotch. Yeah. No. I don't think it's going to affect a lot of sales of aged spirits. Where I think it will really impact sales is cheaper stuff, and macro beers, supermarket wines, the sort of cheap vodkas and cheap tequilas of the world. But people who choose single malt Scotch tend to be what I would call and I'm not trying to slander people who drink other things, but I think if you drink single malt Scotch, you're more of a quote thoughtful drinker than if you are sort of a regular Miller Lite drinker, because you've chosen single malt Scotch for its flavors, for usually for sipping, and sort of taking your time enjoying. Versus, I don't know anybody who takes their time enjoying Miller Lite. That's a thing you drink fast while it's cold. And that's fine. That's what it's designed for. Yeah. But I don't know. Again, with sales declining across the board as they are of all spirits and really of all alcohol in general, I don't think this. I think if somehow the Surgeon General could, wave his hand and implement this in the next 2 weeks before the administration changes, and it would show up on bottles, starting in February. I don't think it would have a huge effect right now. But I think it's a slow burn. And to your point, Joshua, I think it's the beginning of states being able to levy those sin taxes on alcohol. Yep. The way they did on cigarettes.
Whether or not this happens in the US anytime soon, it is actually happening in Ireland, in the Republic. In 2026, there will be a legal requirement for them to have this labeling about, well, it's obviously not the Surgeon General here, but about the linking of alcohol consumption and cancer. So it is already happening, and it wouldn't surprise me if we don't see that happen in more European states, maybe before the US get around to putting it on their books. I think the cigarette thing is maybe an interesting analogy to draw to see whether or not, I mean, like before vapes, and even vapes now in the UK are going to have a whole load of other regulations put into them. But the cigarette thing, I think we put labeling all over it in big, you know, like causes cancer. The thing that really turned people off smoking, I think that really started noticeably changing the numbers, is they started putting horribly graphic photographs on cigarette packets.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And that's really where, I mean, like, we were students, so we were swapping, like, well, do you want a manky lung for one of your other disgusting image cigarettes? So obviously it doesn't necessarily work for childish people. How much did you say a packet of cigarettes is in the US?
I've seen it as much as like $17.99.
Yeah, so cigarettes are still slightly cheaper in the US than they are here. They're maybe like 16 or 17 pounds for a packet of 20 Marlboro Gold here. I mean, when I was working in a shop, Marlboro Gold were £8 a packet. So like we've really hiked some taxes onto cigarettes, and now everybody's vaping, and they're going to have to do a whole load of kind of back rolling of legislation to do with single-use vapes, which I definitely think they need to be stomping that out immediately. And we're also looking at childish flavors. I was talking to my friends. We had a meetup at Christmas at home, and he was smoking a vape that smelled very much like a body spray that I had from the Body Shop circa 2004. You know, like some sort of peach Melba. Yeah, some sort of like peach Melba, raspberry ripple. And I was like, you smell like a 12-year-old girl's bedroom. That's weird. Is that really better than...
It's the cotton candy vape that blows my mind.
We had this kind of like weird nostalgic, like, I miss when pubs smell like cigarettes and not... Yeah, it was a strange conversation to be having in 2024. So yeah, I think it's interesting. There's one other country who do this alcohol labeling, and apparently that's South Korea. That's what the internet told me when I was looking at it. Because we have kind of got some warnings. We obviously have the the logo for like... to remind people that drinking whilst pregnant is obviously extremely dangerous. But I don't think we've gone as far as like specifically naming diseases and illnesses on alcohol. But I imagine it will come, because I think certainly in the UK, we're having a bit of and definitely in Scotland, a little bit of a prohibitionist streak is rearing its slightly ugly head at the outside. And I think that's a dangerous thing. I mean, we can definitely get into this in minimum pricing another day, because it's fascinating and soul destroying in equal measures. And I know that Jason's desperately trying to steer us into something slightly more cheerful whilst we're all ignoring the massive elephant in the room of a very ugly topic.
Yeah. And again, like time just flies when we do these previews here. Yeah. Do you still have a few more minutes to discuss, Susannah?
Yeah. There's something big coming.
Well, just when we're looking over the government's shoulder, you know, I think for all of us, since we had the election in November, we've probably all been bombarded with the same question about tariffs. Will we see the return of them, the extension of them? How quickly? How soon? Like, honestly, we were heading into the holiday period. I happily stuck my head in the sand, paid no attention to the ongoing conversation. Now we're back out in the harsh light of a January day. What do you see for tariffs, for whiskey writ large, not just Scotch, coming into the US in 2025, Susannah?
It's just going to be a mess, a big honking mess. And the latest thing I saw this morning was Trump and his team are considering imposing a general tariff on all countries, but only for essential goods. And I cannot even comprehend how terrible that's going to be for everybody, especially for Americans and our economy. But if that happens, then there probably is not going to be a tariff on Scotch whiskey because I don't think it's considered an essential good by the government. You know, it sounds like it's going to be more things like
we'll need it.
Commodities and I don't know, food perhaps, but Scotch is a luxury good and was specifically targeted as a luxury good in that round of tariffs that were implemented during the previous Trump administration. But I do not think that whiskey is going to go untouched in the next 4 years by tariffs one way or another. If Scotch manages to escape, those tariffs from the EU on American whiskey into Europe are set to come back into play this year.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't see that not happening. I think, you know, again, like God love the bourbon producers, but who's going to be drinking all their extra bourbon because it's not going to be Europe, which I think, you know, like is perhaps a big hope because it's a very mature market for spirits. Plus, okay, China, not if we're tariffing the hell out of China, you know, they're not going to be taking American whiskey. And I think last year we talked about India, India already imposes its own really expensive tariff on imported spirits. So it's a possibility, but it's not going to be the savior of the entire industry. So it's just going to be a really ugly year. Tariffs plus bourbon oversupply plus declining sales. I hope everybody's got, you know, like double undies on. It's just going to be a rough ride.
So you're saying it's time to get into the underwear industry. That's what I'm hearing from this. Okay, everyone's now wearing 2 pairs of underwear. Underwear Nation coming your way soon.
No, I don't have any answers. I would love to stick my head in the sand about this, but it stresses me out every day. And I'm a journalist, right? Like in terms of like direct effects on my day-to-day livelihood, which is not super great anyway, but like, it's nothing compared to people like yourselves who are importers of a good that has been tariffed in the past and could easily become tariffed again. I just have super anxiety about it because I think it's just going to absolutely destroy the shreds of our economy. Actually, no, our economy is doing pretty freaking great, but I think it's going to absolutely crush it. Tariffs are just, there's nothing all economists agree on except how terrible tariffs are.
Well, and they become a race to the bottom, as you were just suggesting a moment ago, right? You don't get to apply tariffs scot-free. They come at a cost. And whether that's a cost for the consumer in the country receiving the tariff, or it's producers trying to send product overseas into burgeoning markets at higher expense.
It's everybody. The cost is borne by everyone, and it's just like which segment bears it the hardest, the worst. I'm curious. I have a question for you guys. I mean, with the prospect of tariffs resuming sometime in the near future, are you front loading your pallets coming over? Like, are you trying to pull in just a bunch of stuff for the year that will at least maybe see you through most of 2025?
I think the good news on that front is the way we want to run business in 25 and beyond already sees us bringing in stock to be prepared ahead of OND, and you can't bring it in soon enough. And so moving production to take that into account may very well protect us in 2025 in uncertain tariff times. They ultimately get you though, right? You can't get far enough ahead if the tariffs remain in place, which is why all that time with extra, we were looking and paying very close attention to when are these tariffs going away and how do we move production to take advantage of that. Now we're just on the opposite side of that. So I think the answer to your question is yes, we do have some front loading in place, but they're going to bite us eventually. The internal conversation for us is how do we protect ourselves going forward? And what was successful previously in protecting ourselves with tariff was taking on the burden and protecting the consumer. And unfortunately, letting the consumer know that we were taking the bullet for them. So honest, open, upfront, transparent conversations about what's really hitting us at a time when we're trying to put interesting quality product into a bottle to sell to you at a good price.
I wanted to bring up one more topic here, and hopefully, and I touched on this earlier on, that I wanted to have a little bit of good news, and I hope this is good news. But, the end of 2024, there was the announcement that American Single Malt is now an official category. And come January 19th of 2025, it's official. There is American Single Malt. Can we talk about the possibilities for that category of whiskey moving forward now that it's become official?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not going to make much difference at all in domestic sales because the officialization of the category, while something that is exciting and should be celebrated, doesn't matter to the average consumer at all. Like, no one outside of the real whiskey nerd community could even tell you anything about what makes bourbon. Yeah. They're not going to know the first thing about American Single Malt, and it won't matter to them. It doesn't change their buying habits that now there's at least like a government rule about it and you can't sell it if it doesn't meet these criteria. So I don't think it's going to make a big difference in that arena. Where I think it might matter, but I don't think it's I think we're gonna have to wait a few years for it to matter much because of the thing we just talked about. I think it's going to matter for international sales, that now there is a stamp of approval from the US government, so that when trade agreements are being worked out, or even it doesn't even have to get to that level, when American whiskey companies that make single malt are talking to Australia or the UK or Japan or wherever and saying, hey, we want to sell this product in your country. And that country says, well, what is it? Like, is this even a thing? How do we even know that, like it is what you say it is? They can say, look, no, we meet these standards. The government had to approve our label and our application, all of this. Like the US government says we are this thing that is recognizable to the rest of the world. The rest of the world, the rest of the whiskey drinking world, I think has a much easier time accepting and understanding American Single Malt than American whiskey drinkers. We are a one whiskey country, and that whiskey is bourbon. Even explaining to people what rye is still a battle. Explain to people what single malt. They're like, oh, so it's American Scotch? No. And yet, sure. Shall we compete? Like, let's compare it. Yes, it does these same things single malt Scotch does, but slightly different. Here are the slight differences if we want to talk about those. So I don't think it's going to make it all a different. Like, it's still really hard to sell American Single Malt to Americans. It just is a lot of education, and most drinkers don't have time or desire to be educated when they're picking out their whiskey for the week or the month. So it's still going to be an uphill battle for distillers. But I think it opens a really important door to the international market that I hope gives, will help American Single Malt as a style, stay rooted and have something to grow towards, even if domestic growth is pretty sluggish.
I'm gonna rain on your parade a bit. I'm really anxious. Like, obviously, as a long certified lover of American Single Malt, I'm very excited. I can tell you, being at whiskey shows, when I've had like a Westland or a VDC under the table, and I've had it as like a little under the table pour, I have exactly the same conversation you do, where they're like, oh, cool, like American Scotch, like, oh, if you say like it's American Single Malt, they're like, they reply and look at you with like that Pikachu face where they go like, bourbon? Like, no, not a bourbon. And it's especially, maybe it's a UK thing, it's really hard to be like, there's a family resemblance to what single malt whiskey from Scotland looks like, but that's not what they're doing. So here, let me pour you a bit, let me talk at you while you're drinking it and explain why something from the Pacific Northwest is not trying to emanate Scotch, but made in America. Like, I think it's a conversation that will have to happen everywhere. I think maybe in countries that are not the UK, sadly, where they have maybe not a stronghold tradition like we have in Scotland, but there is a tradition of making whiskey. Like, people are less freaked out now by when I put a bottle on the table and say, this is Indian single malt whiskey. They're, in countries like Sweden, where they're used to Swedish whiskey being young but passionate craft producers, I think American single malt is not that much of a leap, because they're also relatively young in terms of whiskey production domestically. I think in Australia, I think it'll go down really well because there's a huge craft distilling scene in Australia who will get it much quicker. I still meet people in Scotland who find it really hard to believe that Irish whiskey is worth drinking. So I think the battle is not going to be won in Scotland anytime soon. I think it may take off in England, because the English whiskey scene is phenomenal and it's growing at a pace. Not enough for it to threaten the sales in Scotland. People in Scotland, please do not write into me. But people get it. They want to learn. And I think they're much more receptive much earlier on in their whiskey drinking journey. And that's what I'm hoping that the recognition and the ratification of American single malt as its own category will do. I personally am looking forward to learning a new harmonized code number so that I can put that on my invoices instead of having to sacrilegiously call all American single malts bourbons. That's what it has to go through. So that'll be fun.
I think to your point about Indian whiskey, and I would apply this to, Swedish whiskey, Israeli whiskey, insert country here, Australian whiskey, they, at least in many shops, have the luxury of having a sign in a shop that says world whiskey, right? Or Japanese, whatever it is. And they lump all of those countries into that spot. So if you want to explore single malt or any type of whiskey from another country, you can go to the world whiskey section. Right now, there is no place within a store that says American single malt. You've got Scotch, you've got bourbon, you may have an Irish section, and you may have a world whiskey section. So just to dig in a little deeper, do you think if we got to a place where American single malt had its own set of shelves to bring people in, would that be a game changer in any way? Would it at least help to pique people's interest in the category?
I think so.
As its own thing.
If you're a really small shop, and we're already talking at the top of this show about we've got really full shelves, to make a space that is where do you put American single malt? If you're only going to carry, if you're in the UK, if you're only going to carry 4 SKUs of American single malt, are you really asking a small shop owner to rejig all of that to put them into that?
Well, maybe not in the UK, but
for a long time, what is going to happen is it's still going to be shoved into that bourbon section, because that's also where rye lives. That's also where loads of other American-ish products live. And you're just going to have to hope that they put all the American single malts together so that when people come asking for whiskey, you can come to the shelf, we've got some American single malts and they live here. Because I don't think reasonably, if you went into it, I think if I went into a shop wanting specifically to be that one person of a million that have gone in saying, show me your American single malt section, I would still expect it to be with the other American products. I would not expect to be walking over and, jiggling between, there's Indian, Welsh, Japanese. Some stores have Japan on their own, but oh yes, American single malt. I think it's in the UK, it's going to live within that American misc shelf that counts as bourbon, rye, corn, whatever. I think that's what it's going to be. You're just going to hope that there's a decent stronghold on a shelf of American single malt.
In American stores, I think it would make a difference to have an American single malt section. I don't know that it would be a game changer specifically, but it would absolutely help to just alert drinkers to the fact that this is a thing that exists and it is different from bourbon.
Yeah.
If you have a store with people who are really passionate about American single malt, I would hope they would put that section in and have, employees able to answer questions about what's in it. But to Jess's point, like the crowded shelves, there's just so much to try and sell these days. I think retailers are exhausted. Even the ones who truly love whiskey and have a deep passion for it, I think are just totally, totally exhausted by all these factors that are playing into them having way too much on the shelf and it not moving quickly enough.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe I've rained on the cheeriness of the American single malt announcement But I'm still genuinely very excited about it. I'm
As am I, yeah.
excited to go and annoy some people and be like, let me tell you about this new thing. This is exciting. Let's try these things.
I think it's a really encouraging thing that it took a relatively short period of time for this to happen. I know everyone felt like it was an interminable process, but it was less than a decade that this was in the works. That is... I'm far less than a decade.
I love how positive that is. It was less than a decade.
I can't remember when they first made their application to the TTB, but it was not 10 years ago. Yeah. And it made its way through, several comment periods and whatever internecine workings at the TTB have to take place and to finally become official. And I commend the tremendous effort led by Steve Hawley in large part, but with all the energy and effort of dozens and dozens of American single malt distillers and bottlers like yourselves. I commend them all for getting it done, to the extent that you can control these things outside of the little world of the TTB. Like it's amazing. And that is very encouraging. There is still a huge amount of energy. And hopefully that energy will carry through all of the hurdles that are unfortunately through no fault of American single malt, it will have to overcome, because this is it's a difficult time for selling anything, but especially for something that is still, which I think is hard for us to remember. It's still so brand new.
Yeah.
And actually that was one of my key takeaways from the episode we did with the producers on the day of the announcement, the big announcement, was this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Yeah. And I think for all four of us, we've all been engaged in whiskey education for decades. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can now point at the ratification of a category, it makes our role in educating about that category 1 degree easier. And I think if you are a producer and you do have people coming in to your distillery, your job is made 1 degree easier by having this on the books, and you're not trying to sell people on something you've created, right? Not just the physical creation of this, but even a category that you've created. Right now, the government has said, yep, that exists in the world, move on. And to your point, Susannah, I keep trying to rethink, and it's so difficult, but at all points here, we are just a blip in the time-space continuum. And as we're trying to make grand statements about where's bourbon right now, right? Well, how does that change where bourbon was in the 80s? And will it return? It's like we're always discussing our industry within such rich historical context. But when we peek into the future, what do we have, right? All we have is the history to build on top of that. And so in listening today and discussing today, I'm as I tend to do in these conversations, I'm thinking about my ongoing role, my ongoing responsibility. And it's educational, and it's remembering that we occupy a niche of a niche of a niche. Yesterday I was watching football with one of my kids, and Fireball ad came on, and he was like, "Oh, there's Fireball, Dad. There's Fireball." And I'm like, "Yeah, Fireball. Not even a whiskey." And I used, scare quotes. Not even a whiskey. And he just rolled his eyes. I'm like, "It's 33% alcohol." And he's like, "Dad, I'm not engaging." I'm like, okay, back to the football game. Okay. But I think that's the important thing. And I think that's the thing that keeps the four of us excited across this industry, and the articles that you're writing, Susannah, and the jobs that we're doing in front of consumers. We're in the business of selling. We're passionate about this industry and the ongoing success of this industry, and we'll have our work cut out for us in 25, the same way I remember us having our work cut out for us in 24.
Mm-hmm. Well, Susannah, thank you so much for joining us today. This was, as always, just an enlightening conversation. It's always good just to sit with you. I'm looking at all of our pictures except for Jess. I don't see any bottles in Jess's little window there.
Oh,
but
you can't see. They are all on my desk. They're hidden. And
I just wanted to congratulate all of us for going through some difficult conversations without needing to grab a bottle to calm us down.
Thank you so much for having me. It was always, as always, a pleasure. And I really I wish we could just do this like once a month, just hang out and talk. Doesn't have to be a recording for a podcast. Just like, I don't know. I enjoy pontificating, but even more so, I enjoy hearing what you guys have to say. And of course, I get to hear that on the podcast in general anyway, but like actually being able to respond to it is the fun part.
Yeah. Man, if we had a conversation and didn't record it, that would be like going for a walk and not recording your steps. That hasn't really happened, Susannah. Like, this is only real because we recorded it.
I forgot that. Sorry. My bad.
Well, I'm down for a virtual dram anytime.
Awesome.
Anytime.
Agreed. Awesome. Cheers, Susannah. And
cheers.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, guys.